Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Lacy Brook Pack Killing Moon, Part 1 by Michael Lockhart. Fate, under blue moon I saw you. So soon you'll take me up in your arms, too late to beg you or cancel it, though I know it must be the killing time, unwillingly mine. Echo and the Bunnyman. Lacy watched her daughter, who sat listlessly against the front of the container. The entire pack had sat around, staring or trying to stay awake. She held Earl's head in her lap, such as it was with the configuration of her legs. He slept, and he shivered. His skin was cool and clammy to the touch, as though some anti-fever coursed through his veins. Oscar scooted up next to her, and the two of them kept Grandpa Wolf as warm as they could manage. Earl, too, shifted closer to his sister and held her hand in his. He kissed the side of her face, with a doggy lick, and moan whine growled in words of comfort. She blinked, which was progress, but her stare remained listless, while her dreams wandered in far places. The two Sasquatch clung to one another for the first half hour, and looked nowhere but into one another's eyes. They clearly had some manner to communicate beyond grunts and gestures, and definitely did not care for the close quarters and unnatural motion of the vehicle. Eventually they broke contact, and the female scooted over to peer down at Earl Wolf. She placed her hand over his forehead and eyes and frowned. Lacy was initially concerned by the expression, but soon realized it was a frown of concentration rather than concern. Eventually, Lady Godiva, as Val called her, smiled and stroked Earl's head once, and then placed her hand on his chest over his heart. She scooted back over to her mate, and with her head on his shoulders, fell fast asleep. Shortly, Earl stirred, clearly dreaming. Some healthier color had returned to his cheeks, and his breathing had become less ragged. Lacy could only wonder what images danced around in his personal universe. There had been a sweet voice in the darkness. "Rhonda?" It called out to him as he walked towards it. There was a light from where the sound originated. Golden green sunlight filtered through a forest canopy. A woman stood there before him, tall and stately, and entirely nude, though her long tresses maintained her modesty. Her features were washed out in the bright light, and the details of her form were indistinct. Still, she felt familiar. The love of his life, his wife and soulmate. She'd become even more of who she was. This was her essence. She raised her arm, and he followed her open palm of her extended hand to see a body of water. It looked familiar, and he walked towards it. The sunlight dazzled his eyes even more. The water appeared to be crystal and clean, and to smell fresh, as though it had only just sprung from its source. The normal odors of damp, rotting vegetation and the underlying reek of death and decay were not present in this lake, only the aroma of life. There was a figure in the water, another woman, tall but not towering like the first, more physical, less ethereal. This one had a mass of hair and held out both her arms to him, inviting him to her. He realized that he wanted nothing more than to reach her, and started forward. The truck was ultra-modern, and the cargo container was integrated with the tractor portion, so Val managed to handle it well enough. She wasn't sure whether they should go to see Dr. Miriam Stone. Miriam thought Earl had died, and she had grieved his passing. Val was sure that Miriam would forgive him once she managed to get over the shock and resentment. In any case, she would do her best to save Earl's life. It was in her nature to help wounded critters. She might even be able to help Adele. On the other hand, The rig was likely tracked, so it might invite disaster to bring the mini menagerie to Earl's old place, which he'd left for Miriam's grandson in his now executed will. Naturally, Jacob had let his mother and grandmother stay with him. After all, his mother still had to countersign for him until he turned 18. There were potential allies, but perhaps not timely ones. Maybe best save for another day or not at all. Sheriff Cloud was the best option. The trackers would expect them to flee towards authorities, but he was in the next county over, so maybe it would be enough to hold off pursuit for a short time. Trackers would be less likely to assault law enforcement facility. At least, most would be hesitant, she decided. Never know with the monsters and mad scientists. She reached down to her side and realized she no longer had her cellular device. Well, sorry, Gino. You're going to get a surprise. The next debate was whether to drop off Lacy and her pals before she dropped the truck off at the sheriff's department. If so, how would she handle Earl? Should she take him along or leave him with the others? She wondered how he was. She noted the monitor. It was currently dark, but with the swipe of a switch, it clearly lit the cargo space and its occupants. It was a split screen and displayed 2 angels so that she could check on everybody. There was another switch on the display. She activated it and could hear the heavy breathing and panting of large bodies in an enclosed space. "Hello, my friends. Can you hear me?" She knew immediately from their reaction that they could. "How are our wounded?" Lacy gave her a thumbs up, a gesture they shared. "Good. Do you need anything? Water or food?" After a short conference with each other, Lacy shook her head. "I'm thinking of going to Jean's department with the truck. Do you want to stay on board or get off as soon as we reach your territory?" There was another conference, during which Earl opened his eyes and raised up from where he had lain across Lacy and Oscar's upper legs. Merde. Valerie had to swerve back into her lane. She had almost run head-on into a big logging truck, whose driver now laid on the air horn, no doubt cursing the fool in the other truck. "Sorry, I was a dumbass, looking at the screen instead of the road. Now I know why these things are illegal for drivers." "I'm fine. We have to get back into the woods, though. The pack needs to hunt and to be secure. Adele will come around, I think. It was a medical facility. She probably just doped to keep her under control." When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was hers, and she blinked. Earl's voice was coarse and deeper than it had been, but it was clearly his. "I'll go back to sleep. I'm so cold. Wait, why am I naked? How is that possible?" Val pulled up in the long vehicle parking area at a convenient plaza. It was designed for big trucks and recreational vehicles. She hoped Hassan would be on duty. It had been fun to jack him out of information. Perhaps her charms would work a second time. He was likely over his anger. She was relieved that the goons at the mad scientist lab hadn't robbed her. They'd left her little clip that held some cash, her driver's license, and a bank card. She stuffed into her front pocket. It was evening and the other shops had closed for the day. She looked around for the store and found a T-shirt with the picture of a coyote or wolf picked out in rectangular spots on the front, possibly inspired by some First Nations tribal artwork, more likely designed in a big city studio by someone who had never been near a reservation. Still, it was apropos, and the only other shirt available, in size 3X, sported a largemouth bass hooked on a fishing lure. Surrounding it were letters that proclaimed, "Don't be a dumb bass." She chuckled. Earl would like that one too. There were some extremely poor quality beach shorts and flip-flops on display at enormously inflated prices. "Beggars can't be choosers, Uncle Earl. These will allow you to go into a larger retail shop. Store security will definitely tail you, especially if you're not taking anything into the fitting room." Near the register, this time operated by a middle-aged fellow who talked constantly into a device with an earpiece and a microphone. She found a pair of cotton serape blankets and added them to her little pile of goods. The man never looked at Valerie Lefevre, something extraordinarily rare in her experience, at least since she had been about 14. He stared into the middle distance as he scanned the tags on the items. Looks like the zombies, she thought, and then looked more closely. Nope, just rude and probably doesn't speak much of the local language. Doesn't want to either. Just glad to be anywhere but in whatever miserable place he was born. You're welcome, buddy. Try to assimilate, or at least pretend. The man shoved the items back at her under the plastic protective screen that was fixed above the counter space, and looked up as though there was another customer behind her. Definitely a relative of Hassan, she concluded. He continued to jabber in what was possibly a language, but one Val had never heard. Val shook her head in wonderment as she returned to the truck. She crept open the cargo door and passed the items into a hairy waiting hand. "These are for Uncle Earl," she hissed. Earl gratefully accepted the apparel, but opted to remain in the back of the truck. 1, I'll look and feel ridiculous in public view. 2, we may have to communicate and I can translate. 3, I don't want you to see me like this. I'm still confused and not sure what will happen. I haven't changed all the way back to what I was, and maybe I won't. Perhaps that's for the best. I feel pretty strong and healthy, like just after the first time a cryptid clawed me. We'll see. Let's get back to home turf. Valerie stopped the truck at the end of a logging trail, just off the highway. She'd managed to back it up to the gate without slipping off the edge of either culvert. Guess if lawyering doesn't work out, I can always operate a big rig, she laughed as she opened the doors. All out for Lacy Brook Pack territory. All but Adele aroused and arose. Earl, too, lifted his sister and carried her to the open doors. Lacy and Oscar leapt down first. Oscar reached up and took his now sleeping daughter from the arms of her brother, while Lacy hurried over to a pole that stood beside the gate of the logging road. She bound up and slapped at something on the pole, just under a metal shaded light that illuminated the metal gate with its cattle guard implanted across the opening. Val realized what it was she must have swatted when Lacy picked up an object and dashed it against the rails of the cattle guard until nothing was left but a few bits of plastic and wire. Camera shy, sis? Val teased. If it caught us. It's already sent the signal. Lacy grinned and patted Valerie on the shoulder with a little huff of breath. The pat sent her stumbling and coughing from the impact and the reek, respectively. She shook her head and sighed. Earl watched the little tableau play out. She says it's an older model game trail cam. Someone had to come out and get the recorder. Before you ask, I have no idea how she knows, he shrugged. I know too, for that matter, and I'm not sure why. Earl stroked Adele's sleeping face with his hand, a regular human hand. The nails were a little thick and long, but they were clearish, and there was no longer a paw. He looked up and smiled. After that first blink when we looked at each other, there was several more, then a confused look around the cargo space. After all, she snuggled into Earl too and slept like she hadn't since she was a pup. He gripped his grandson's shoulder, proud of how the young dogman had nurtured his sister. Val ensured that all the lights from the truck were off before she exited the cab. It was a dark night, but clearly not for the pack. Lacy pulled Earl aside and they conferred for a moment. He was able to make most of the sounds he needed for their former common language, and the gestures were the same. He used human speech to fill in the gaps for noise that only a muzzle could make. He approached Val and looked down at her. He was still around 6.5 feet tall. He'd always been over 6, but only slightly. Lacy has informed me that most of my wolf stink is gone, but while I smell much better than I did, I can't keep up with the pack in my current state. She's ordered me to go with you." Val shrugged. "Okay, but we have to get you into some decent clothes. You're built like a brick, chiseled, but you are still a hairball. You look like you'd shaved off a few years, if not hair. Not so much gray, except for the wolf tones." She winked. The pack agreed to meet near the bridge for Piney Creek the next night after moonrise. It was just down the next side road, and familiar to all of them. Lucy gave Earl a long, knowing look and then hugged him. He hugged her back. "Take care, my darling lass," he muttered to her. She grinned and huffed, then turned to follow the rest as they disappeared into the gloom of the night. The keeper ran to the little control room and activated the lockdown protocol switch. The electronic announcements were not as loud as the other alarms and lasted only until the physical part of the procedure was complete. A concrete wall slid into place to cover the doorway that entered the facility from the garage. It essentially replaced the wall and included some materials and devices that would mask any detection equipment. The same occurred with the back door. An interior wall blocked off the stairway that led down into the corridor and beyond. The space became a maintenance auxiliary station. Any officials that came to check the secret lab would rule the reporting parties as fraud or fools. Most of the control room had been destroyed by large creatures with sharp claws and enormous strength. The live monitor on duty was now so much hamburger on the floor, and in some cases on the panels and furniture, even a few bits on the walls and ceilings. Just as well. We may be locked down for a few days. We'll need food for the monster zoo," he said aloud to the empty room. He started when a voice sounded from the doorway. "So that's what this place is. That's why my wife and so many of our colleagues are drugged and placed in a room that may as well be a jail cell." Dr. Francois Blanchard stood, arms akimbo and swaying slightly. He looked much better than he had when he'd first come out of the zombie stupor. He stood straight, and his musculature seemed fuller, less flaccid than it had been when the needle had entered his arm. "Dr. Blanchard, you are mistaken. This is a medical research facility. You and the others contracted a rare—" The keeper didn't make it any further. "I don't know who you are, but do you think me an ignorant fool? This is part of the price to which we all agreed so long ago. We had no idea that it would mean enslavement. We thought it all had to do with saving lives without having to go through all the ridiculous regulations and endless testing. Our little cabal agreed to retire in a rural area to work in secret. Our names lost to history while our work ensured the history would continue. That was to be the price. To save humanity in anonymity, no glory, no appreciative masses, just the knowledge that we achieved the next stage for our species." The keeper had grown nervous. He knew that there was a pistol in a drawer. Maybe, if the monsters that trashed the room hadn't removed it. Dr. Blanchard looked angry and menacing. His hair was no longer wispy and light gray. It was the color of iron, and it seemed his will was made of that very substance. "Doctor, we have a medical emergency on our hands. Dr. Z has had a heart attack. I need to get back to him. Maybe you could help?" Blanchard stared at him. Through him, it seemed, for a long, uncomfortable moment. "I will help. Perhaps then Ignat will offer an intelligible explanation. It seems you are incapable of such." They found Dr. Z on his side, curled into a fetal ball. The IV still plugged into his arm, but the bag was now nearly empty. He clearly had a high fever and was unconscious, perhaps even comatose. They lifted him onto the table, and Francois looked around for the medications on hand. Ahem. They were interrupted by the clearing of a throat from the corridor. It was Narcissa. "What's happening? I no sooner stepped inside the back door than an alarm sounded and sealed me inside. Why are we in lockdown mode?" Val pulled the big panel truck into the far lot at the box stores that reportedly sold everything. "You must be hungry, biggin. I'll get some apples and maybe some bread. A few carbs might keep you from passing out again. I hate to buy clothes at the same place I buy food, but we need to get you into something less conspicuous." Earl smiled and nodded. "Thanks, Valerie. I'm in need of a nap while you shop. Maybe a bottle of red wine, the fortified cheap stuff that the winos drink. Just a small bottle. I want the alcohol in my system. I think it may clean out some of the remaining gunk. I crave meat, but I want to ensure that the changes are fixed before I try it. And I'm afraid it will have to be well done for a while. The changes should be permanent, so if so, then we've worked out how to reverse werewolfism." "Mostly. I can't believe that you barged into that cell. If I already hadn't been so weak, I'd have chomped first and mourned later." "Yeah, and I'd have kicked a goal with your doodahs. I'm a badass these days, thanks to some excellent mentoring and training," Val grinned. "Lock up while I'm gone. Shouldn't be too long." She quickly found what she needed and picked out a pair of jeans, a pair of side-pocket trousers, and a couple of plain Oxford-style shirts. The 3X sizes seemed to be designed for more girth than height, but they were all that was available. The shoe selection was truly sad. She ended up selecting a pair of cheap work boots rather than athletic shoes. She'd noticed that Earl still walked on the balls of his feet. It looked natural the way he did it, but the slightly heavier footwear would make his getting less noticeable, and if they were going to spend money, her money, they would wait on other styles until he could select his own. Before she left the menswear department, she paused to pick up some drawers, as he called underwear, and a 6-pack of socks. Now we can walk into the SO without too much scrutiny, though with that big bushy hair and beard, the country popo would look harder at Earl. Hopefully as a super hottie. I'll be a distractor, she smiled. Then she looked at a mirror as she passed the fitting room. Merde, girl, you look like crap. On that note, she rolled her cart over to the women's wear. She had washed her body in the cell, but not as thoroughly as she liked, or as she thought. She needed fresh clothing and drawers of her own. She had to make a few more stops to find items to clean the two of them, a couple of packs of wipes, a small grooming kit, and a hairbrush. I won't be up for my normal runway standards, but will fit in nicely enough in this area, among my peeps. She smiled again. When she reached the checkout area and paid for the goods, she realized she had not been at work for days and hadn't called anyone. Merde, I may not have an income to pay for that. The employee who monitored the self-checkout lanes, a pleasantly plump elder, gazed at her over her readers. What's that, my sweetie? Do you need help? Just talking to myself, aloud, Val responded. Don't worry, so far I haven't answered. She giggled in the vacuous manner she used so often to lull others into underestimating her intellect. It seemed to work, and the unfortunate grandmother, who had had to fight inflation by reducing the workforce post-retirement, moved on to assist other customers. Val shook her head. Since when can I read a person's life story? Getting cynical in my dotage. Earl was thoroughly zonked when she got back to the truck. She knocked on the driver's side door to get his attention, and he came instantly awake and alert, swiveling his head to search out the danger. He saw her and grinned. Dang, Earl, you look great, but you still have some big white fangs. And the breath. Not so much, she thought. She pointed to the cart full of bags, so he'd understand that it was time for him to help load the groceries and sundries. He opened the door and hopped down as she rounded the front of the truck. She immediately recalled the way he had formerly moved, always cautious of his knees. Being a werewolf was good for him, she concluded. Why don't we put everything in the back? Then we can take turns changing and getting ourselves in order, he suggested. Maybe I should go first so you can stay in the back for a while. My instincts are starting to merge with a little scrubbing. I can pass as fully human. I know where we are, and the SO is just down the road. Jean won't be here that late, but maybe somebody we know will be, or can convince them to wake their boss. Val nodded. I've been thinking through. Yes, let's change, but then let's walk to the SO. If we leave the truck here and they track it, it will be in a public place, and they won't be able to track us so easily, unless they can access the security system, in which case they will see what we already know, and we left the truck in this lot. Good idea, he grinned. You done gotcha a big old brain, girl. He growled the last word, and they shared a little laughter. They'd gotten themselves in order and prepared to set out when a deputy pulled into the police parking for the store. They approached carefully. It was a new member of the force, so neither of them was familiar with him. Good evening, deputy. May we speak with you? Val initiated the conversation. Even not quite put together, she was attractive enough that any young man would be at least stop and listen. Earl hung back a little. No one wanted to speak with a big hairy dude with scary teeth and eyes who seemed a little dazed. Yes, ma'am. Is it an emergency? I'm here in response to a theft call from the store staff. He was professionally friendly and presumably not really a rookie, just new to the department. It won't take a moment if that's okay. We'll walk in with you while we talk, Val volunteered. The deputy nodded and turned towards the entrance. So, how can I help you? We're friends of Sheriff Cloud. I know we look sketchy at the moment, but I promise he will appreciate hearing from us. My name is Val Lefevre, and this is Earl Brooks. Jean knows us both well. I grew up nearby, and I'm now an attorney in the city. We ran into some pretty bad characters in the next county, down by the lake as well. Jean always offered to help. He and Sergeant Knox taught me to shoot. Deputy Kane listened with half an ear, focusing on his duty call as well as the walk-up information. He wasn't sure whether he liked the name-dropping, but Knox was his lieutenant. It would be easy to confirm. He activated his radio mic. SO 7260? When the dispatcher acknowledged. SO 7260. If he's free, send me 745 by my location. A voice familiar to all three responded. SO 7045. I'm direct, en route, 10 minutes. It was Tom Knox. Thank you, Deputy Kane. We know you are busy. We'll wait out by the front entrance, Val said. The timing was perfect. They'd reached the manager's office area and was behind the service counter. That's where the accused, alleged, and otherwise in no way listed in any documents as being in my way culpable or guilty thief would be detained. The soon-to-be-charged subject's voice arose from the office area as Kane opened the door. Come on, man, you know me. I'm Jack Elbert. I got people here. I've been here all my life. The door closed and the voice was shut off with the closing of the latch. Val looked up at Earl with a grin. Looks like the extended Elbert family is still fulfilling the role of leading the local turd faction. This was the first time she'd had a good look at Earl under bright fluorescent lighting. His hair was bushy and wild. His beard was the same. She'd snipped most with the scissors, but it was in need of proper grooming. The beard was a rich red and gold that went well with the deep auburn of the briar patch on his head. It was all shot with silver, like a wolf pelt, more than an aging man. His eyes were bright and a light gray-green, encircled with a thin red ring. His nostrils seemed to flare a bit, and his nose was perhaps wider through the middle, just a hint of snout rather than the near blade it had been before his transformation. He was broader through the shoulders and chest. He'd already been a large man. The teeth were not quite as frightening under the bright luminescence. They were pearly and gleamed, and they were just a tiny bit larger and sharper than normal for the human species. His walking gait had developed into a toe-first style, like that of a forest dweller, and he tended to rest on the balls of his feet, as any good predator would. All in all, he displayed primal vibrance, she concluded. Yeah, buddy, you'll do, provided you have the same soul and personality of the man I knew. For his part, Earl was relieved that the desire to slaughter and devour this lovely young lady who meant so much to him had subsided. He was thirsty, and the bright lights annoyed him. He got a whiff of Val, still a bit raw and without the normal perfumes of soap and modern hygiene products. He liked her natural scents and found that new feelings stirred in him, disturbing in a different way than the previous sentiment towards mayhem had been. Hey, Val, I hate to impose further on your bank account, but could we get a drink before we go outside? I haven't had a Dr. Pepper in ages. He's stable. The fever has not lowered, but it is level. With fluids, he should recover, Dr. Blanchard informed the henchman. And though they only barely comprehended, the two Z-Techs, one of whom was his wife and the other an acquaintance, Karen Rizzo, they had helped him with care of Dr. Zolovok, and duties completed with no follow instructions, stood by, staring and breathing mindlessly. Narcissa didn't really care as long as Dr. Z or his employers made arrangements to pay him. He just returned from checking on his charges in the Z-Tech dorm. The other zombies throughout the facility had all been killed. He didn't care about that either. He simply wanted his money and to leave this place. Since the lockdown, he decided that it was too dangerous to remain. Haiti was calling, and he wanted to answer promptly. The keeper was relieved. He was not done with his duties at the facility. There were a few more steps towards Dr. Z's goal, his great unknown plan. Worst case, if Dr. Z croaked, he could take over and have some fun with the monsters, until only the strongest, the Genoisqua, most likely was left. He'd leave that one to starve. First he had to settle Francois Blanchard. He didn't trust Narcissa to stay around to keep the old doctor under control. That's great, Dr. Blanchard. Thank you so much for your help. Is there anything else we can do for him? Blanchard shrugged. He will live or he will die. We will know within the next few hours. If we keep him hydrated, he has a chance. Until we can control whatever the infection is, we can't do anything for his heart. He looks good, though. In that regard, quite flushed, as though he'd had strong circulation. His pulse is rapid, but strong. He shrugged again. The keeper nodded, then raised the pistol that had been in the drawer in the control room after all. Thanks again, Doc. He fired into Francois' shoulder, and the man fell to the floor screaming. The Z-Techs didn't even flinch, despite the gore that splashed onto him. He'd still get Narcissa to give him a touch-up on the venom and hypnotherapy. In the meantime, Blanchard's cries had grown annoying. Shut up, Doc. I'm going to introduce you to my favorite specimen in the entire facility. If we had more time, maybe I'd feed you to one of the creatures that takes its time and plays with its food. But I have my duties. And since we are currently short of staff, lucky for you. Earl and Val made it out to the front of the store just as Lieutenant Knox arrived. He'd very recently promoted, and now he had a shift to run. He had no idea why Kane had called him, but he quickly recognized Val. It took him a moment to study the big hairball beside her. Earl? Really? How? Hey, Tom. Long story and an urgent one. Is there a better place to talk? Can we get Jean in on the conversation? Earl prompted. Tom nodded. Sure, come on. Plenty of old roads out in the sticks. He first checked in by radio with Kane to see if he needed anything. He paused for a moment to help Kane load Jack effin' Elbert into his unit and head off for the jail. Kane was clearly distracted and curious about the pair of rough characters who were apparently tight with his lieutenant, but knew better than to take his eyes off the arrestee for too long. After some radio and phone traffic, and after recovering the items they wanted from the big truck, the three set off for the isolated home of Sheriff Gene Cloud. Earl had been there previously. He knew Gene would want to meet them out away from his family, since it was business. He kept them as far from it as possible. Gene was in his own SUV, and they pulled up driver door to driver door. Tom hadn't told him much on the phone, just that he had citizens with an urgent need to meet him. He didn't see the large, dark figure that slipped out of the passenger side of Tom's vehicle and walked around the back of his to approach his own passenger side. He saw Val sitting beside Tom and looking frazzled. Hey, girl, lawyering got you worn down and upset? It was a guess and a greeting in one. Val smiled. You have no idea, Sheriff, but chasing bomb balances is not what has me against the wall. You and Tom helped turn me into an action junkie, but things have gone way too interesting lately. Gene nodded. Don't forget Earl, he did his part to turn you. Thanks for including me, Gene. The voice was familiar, but deeper and with a hint of a rumble. Gene turned towards the open passenger window, surprised and with his heart in his throat, and saw a large, hairy figure looming. He flinched and snatched at his sidearm, but settled almost immediately. What the? How? I saw you not so long ago when you were... A werewolf? Earl finished for him. It seems there's a cure after all, though I think there was some unusual factors at work in my favor. In any case, I wouldn't recommend it. Seems to have shaved off some years, or at least the mileage, but the process? The last was a growl that still sounded too close to lupine for Gene's taste. So let's make sure I have this. You were kidnapped by weirdos out in the wood in the next county. They put you in a secret lab, and a mad scientist and his freaky assistants experimented on you and on other cryptids. Lacy's pack and a Sasquatch helped rescue you. Now you want me to take a team and go back and bust the lab? Gene asked, all while questioning whether he should have added sarcastic inflections to the question. Earl and Val nodded in unison. That's about it, High Sheriff, Earl added. I'd also recommend that rather than processing the panel truck, maybe you should monitor it. See who comes for it. It's high-tech inside, and they had only the one, so they'll be wanting it back soon. Gene smiled. You realize, of course, that this means I will have to bring in Sheriff Blake and some of her folk as well as the state troopers since it's state property. Maybe we can keep the feds at bay. Don't need them sticking their nose in our area. He sat back, head down, a frown of concentration on his face. I agree on the truck watch. Thanks to the big cities losing so many officers, we've picked up some real crackerjack cops. Just in time. We were stretched thin over the winter, bottom line. I've had enough that I can spare some for watch duty, as long as we keep them on call for 911. Won't hurt to have someone in the parking lot all that time anyway. Since we get so many calls, we keep them up near the entrance. People are used to seeing our units there for shoplifters and the various intoxicated people who like to go shopping at dark early and have fits under the bright lighting. Sorry, I was thinking out loud. As for the operation, that will take some more planning, but we'll have it ready tomorrow, maybe Saturday. Val grinned in anticipation. So just to be clear, what day is it? I couldn't tell from the inside of that cell. No windows. Thursday, Earl supplied. I have this weird internal clock thing. We're meeting the rest of the pack tomorrow night, if that helps. Gene shook his head. I can't involve you in this, Earl. According to all records, you're a dead man. Valerie, I just wouldn't recommend it at this point. We'll have you write up a statement after you've had time to rest from your trauma, he air quoted. In other words, as soon as you have time to make up something plausible. By mid-morning, please. We'll need to get a warrant. It would help if we could have one from you, Earl. I can't get you a new ID in time. So where are you two staying tonight? Earl and Val ended up staying at Tom and Julie's house. They finally got to meet their little fellow Arthur. And Julie clearly had another bun in the oven. Girl this time. We're thinking Amanda, sticking with the A. Names. Besides, it means that their initials will be AK, she grinned. Arthur was up later than usual. He was a night owl like his folks. He was fascinated by Earl's beard and immediately entangled his little fingers in it and pulled. Earl was equally interested in the little person who stood on his lap. He was tremendously relieved that he felt no desire to gobble up the little fellow. In fact, he felt unreasonably protective, the opposite of what he would have felt as a werewolf. Maybe I truly been cured, he considered. Too early to tell. I may have to see about sleeping in the garage, just in case. Dr. Ignat Slovok's eyes clicked open, and he roared in rage from the hyper-realistic dream he'd just vacated. In it, he'd been a powerful being constructed of fury. He'd smashed everything in sight and enjoyed the strength in his body that allowed him to do so. Then he'd grown angry that his strength was even greater, so he'd picked up some large rocks and thrown them at everything his dream self perceived. Dreamscape, wildlife, trees, and eventually people all splashed satisfyingly, and then his perception shifted, and he grew angry that his targets faded. Now he was awake in his new reality, his sides heaving and body covered in a sheen of sweat. His memories were clouded, but he knew where he was. He'd been sick, in pain. He looked down at where the IV needle entered his arm and ripped it from him in unreasoning anger. That hurt, so he picked up the IV pole and rammed it through the midsection of one of the Z-techs that had been set to monitor him. She had picked up the phone to alert the keeper once she'd perceived that her charge was awake and active. She activated the call, but did not get to speak. She watched as her lifeblood leaked onto the floor of the little room. It was all part of the same nightmarish sequence to Helen Blanchard on her journey to join her husband. So quotes. This raven Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.